Well, thank you all for being here. Certainly appreciate you guys coming out tonight. We are delighted, extremely lucky, to have with us Kazima Ship-Chandler, who is the CFO of GE Aviation Services. So he's going to speak with us tonight about his personal experiences, his perspective. We were speaking just before this. I think we'll get a great discussion on diversity, on leadership, on what it takes, to make it out there. So with that, please help me welcome Chandler.
Great. It's on? Okay. So I'll talk about basically whatever you guys want to talk about. I'll take questions, whatever. I thought I'd just start with a few opening remarks, and I think the topic is diversity, but I'm going to go in a couple different directions to just give you guys some thoughts in general. I don't have a prepared set of slides or anything like that. I think PowerPoint has sort of become the death of communication. So we'll stay away from that. And questions that you guys want to ask, feel free to interrupt me at any time, and then we'll try to make it a little bit interactive after that. So just to start off with, I was having dinner with a few of these guys, and one of the things that I talked about initially is that you guys are in school and going to graduate in a time frame which is very different than the time frame in which I graduated. I graduated in 1996, and so I've been in the working environment now for about 14 years. And I think the single biggest change that's transpired during that period of time is when I graduated, if you spoke a little bit of Japanese or a little bit of German, you were basically golden walking into the workforce. And the whole landscape is basically different now. And I think the world that you're walking into is basically as follows. When you go to bed every night, on the other side of the planet, there are 2.5 billion people that want what you have. And they're going to do anything that it takes to get what you have, and they're going to work 24/7 to get there. And that's just the competitive reality that you're graduating into or going to graduate into over the next few years. And the sooner that you come to terms with that, the better, because that's just how the world is going to work. And it's a very unique and in some ways frustrating competitive landscape because it means that you have to work harder and you have to be a lot more global than you ever could have imagined, certainly sitting in my shoes just a few years ago. So having said that, it's not like all is lost and you should go back to your room and drink yourself into a stupor or anything like that. It's actually, I think the future holds a lot of promise. And as it relates specifically to diversity, here are kind of the challenges that I see going forward. I think diversity, first of all, as a notion, it is important, okay? So I'm not trying to minimize its importance in any way, shape, or form, but I think the reality is that diversity in large part is a very kind of US concept, right? It's about, are you black or are you white? Are you a male or are you a female? Are you heterosexual or are you of some other different sort of sexual orientation? And I think those are sort of the boxes that, in the US at least, we try to label diversity. And I can talk about some of the things that GE does to facilitate that discussion, because it is an important one, and it's one that has not evolved fully to the point where it probably needs to be. But more important, I think, is that you're in a global environment today. You probably collaborate with individuals in your classes and in your teams, and if you've gone through I-Corps now, with people that are from all different sorts of cultures, from all different parts of the world, that speak different languages. And that's really the competitive landscape that you walk into. When you walk in the door in the morning, when you go to work, you're going to get on conference calls with people that are working in Japan or China and India, in Europe. When you hit midday, the people in Europe will be about to go home, and you're going to need them for that last bit of analysis before they go home. When you're about ready to go home, the head office in China or India or whatever, they're just going to be walking in the door, and they're going to need information to be able to do business on their side of the world. And so I think more important than diversity in some ways is this notion of how do you do business in a global environment, because that's the world that you're going to walk into, and that's the world that I face and that Jason faces every single day. And in some ways it's not more important necessarily, but it's just as important as sort of the conventional notions of diversity. A couple other things to think about when it comes to diversity. Again, we think about it in terms of boxes, black, white, male, female, sexual orientation. And the thing is about all of that is that whatever your personal beliefs, whatever your political leanings, you have to be able to work in a world, whether it's in the US or any other part of the world, that has a diverse environment to it. And I'll give you a couple specific examples as it relates to GE. You know, the reality is that everybody wants to contribute, okay? No matter what their background is, and we can label it any different sort of way, we can put different permutations together. Everybody wants to contribute and everybody has good ideas, and you know, everyone brings unique perspectives to bear, typically to solve a problem better than it otherwise could have been solved if it had just been one viewpoint. You know, and traditionally, and unfairly, I think that's traditionally sort of been labeled as white male. But today, people, whether it's women, whether it's people of race, whether it's people of different sexual orientation, I think they bring unique perspectives, they have different belief systems, and all of those things inform problems in unique ways that just make the answers a lot better and allow people to relate to other cultures and this global phenomenon that I spoke of earlier in a better way than they had previously. And the thing is, and I'm getting to my specific example, your politics are kind of irrelevant. I'm not saying that anybody should throw out their personal belief system, but sometimes you have to park your politics or your value-based beliefs at the door. You don't want to lose your integrity, that's not what I'm saying, but whatever kind of personal beliefs that somehow inform your personal life aren't always applicable in the same way when it comes to your corporate or nonprofit or whatever path you choose life. In the aviation business specifically, that's where I work, that's the part of GE that I work in. You know, there's been a congressional battle over a long period of time over Joint Strike Fighter funding. So I don't know if you know much about this issue. The Joint Strike Fighter is basically the next generation fighter plane that will dominate the landscape basically for the next 30 years in terms of US military power. It's been a very contentious issue. One of our key competitors, Pratt & Whitney, a long time ago was selected as the primary engine for this application. And GE, in conjunction with Rolls-Royce, our partner, has been fighting for the second engine position, as it's known, on that particular fighter plane. And as we try to secure a position on that airplane, what we're finding is that it doesn't matter whether someone's a Republican or a Democrat. What matters is that are they on the congressional committee that is willing to put its backing behind the funding of this engine on this airplane? And so a lot of people in our company, you know, there's sort of the stereotype that business people tend to be Republicans. I think there's some level of truth to that. The reality is that our predominant manufacturing capacity as it relates to defense is in Lynn, Massachusetts, where a very prominent former congressman, i.e. Ted Kennedy, had a very strong position. And so for us, and if you know the politics of Massachusetts, it leans very heavily Democratic. It's been very, very important to cultivate those relationships with the Democratic side. In addition to that, the fact that they are the dominant party in Congress right now has not been lost on us. And so it is all the more important to cultivate relationships on both sides of the aisle. So while I personally may be a Republican, I would argue a liberal Republican, but a Republican nonetheless, it's extremely important that I understand the other side, that I cultivate relationships on the other side, that I work with colleagues on the other side, because those views matter, and I need them just as much as they need me. You know, the other topic that's kind of become more relevant as of late is this topic around sexual orientation. You know, when I was in school here, I can tell you the student newspaper, this was like a raging debate on the editorial page every single day. The debate, big debate in particular, was whether or not student fees should be used to fund the club. And I don't know how that turned out. I didn't follow it all that closely, to be honest. I was kind of into other things when I was on campus here, but it matters, because that is probably one of the more disenfranchised groups that's out there. And I think as you're going to find quickly, they have just as many contributions to make as do any of the rest of us. Whether you're heterosexual or any other type of sexual identification, those views matter, and those people have contributions, and they're people just like the rest of us. And I think that's going to become an emerging topic. It's already emerged, quite frankly, and it's going to become a bigger deal in your careers than it has been in mine even, and you're going to have to reconcile that at some point. You know, let me hit one more and then I'll hit your question. The last one that I don't want to lose, that I think people also shouldn't lose sight of in this discussion and dialogue around diversity is, you know, white males still matter. Okay, they've sort of become a disenfranchised group as time goes on because we've focused so much on some of the other gender, racial stereotypes that we sometimes forget that that group of individuals matters also. And so as we have the discussion, whether it's today, tonight, tomorrow, next year, whenever, let's not lose sight that that's a critically important group that's got to be part of the dialogue that contributes just as much as the rest of us do as well. And so sort of as a general backdrop, let me kind of leave you with that to plant a couple seeds, and then I'll talk about a couple other things, but let me answer a question.
My question was, how is like GE planning to for this new engagement in diversity? Because you mentioned your sexual orientation and things of that sort. How is GE preparing for that new upbringing, this new diversity into the business world?
So we do a couple things. The way that we've approached it is in a couple different ways. One is we have what we call different forums. So we have an African American forum. We have a women's network. We have an Asia Pacific American forum. We have a Hispanic forum, and we have a what we call GLBTA. I'm going to get this wrong, but Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transsexual Alliance. Did I get that right? I think that's the kind of major company-sponsored forums. Okay, so these are organizations that have leadership across every single one of our GE businesses. And by the way, okay, I'm not pretending that GE has the monopoly on answers here. Okay, I mean we're in the debate and we're trying to figure it out just as much as any other company is. But that's one attempt that we've made where we've got very senior people across the company that are not affiliated with those groups, either visually or in terms of what they represent in terms of their personal beliefs, that sponsor these groups. We then have very senior people across the company that, say you're African American, that will hold a senior leadership position and sponsor those groups. And then what the groups then go and do is a couple things. The biggest single thing is to raise cultural awareness. The second equally biggest thing is to ensure that we have a pretty good retention program. That if you're a person of color, or if you're a Hispanic person, or if you're a female, that you have access to mentors and you can see a career path for yourself because you see other individuals. If you're a woman, that you see a very senior person, senior female in the GE community that you can aspire to be if you do some of the same things that she did, or if you follow the path that you want to follow. One day you can get to that position if you kind of, the cards fall where they do for you. And then the third thing is that they're very actively involved in recruiting. So identifying individuals in campus, as well as externally, if we can bring in people at a kind of mid-level and brainwash them in sort of the GE way, then that's good too. So those are some of the things that we're attempting in terms of sort of the conventional US definition of diversity. On a global scale, we're doing a lot of other different things. In different countries around the world, we actually employ more people outside of the U.S. than we do in the U.S. That's kind of a little known fact about GE. A bit unusual for most large multinational companies, U.S.-based at least. And within each of those countries, we have community service organizations that are very strong, that are very focused on needs of those countries, whether it be health, whether it be childcare, whatever, that don't specifically relate to employees' needs. They might, but also relate to the needs of those countries and cultures. And so those are just a few attempts that we've made to kind of solve that problem. Again, not pretending to have a monopoly on answers, but having taken some strides in that way. Okay? The other thing that I wanted to touch on that I also spoke of a few moments earlier is that, in your lifetime, what I hope to see is diversity kind of become an irrelevant topic. If you look around this room, Jason can tell you, if you don't believe me, every single meeting that I'm in looks like this room. Okay, not because we're trying harder than anybody else. I'd like to think that we're trying hard to increase our representation, but it's not about that. It's about recruiting the best and the brightest. And when I sit in a meeting at GE, most of the meetings that I participate in look like this room. And I feel pretty good about that, okay? Both from a global standpoint as well as from a US standpoint. I was telling the guys earlier that I travel a lot, and even when I go to the UK, it's in a room that looks like this. Even when I go to Japan, there are more Caucasian faces than you might think. There are more women than you might think. And that's a pretty good feeling. And I think it's going to become an irrelevant thing as you go through your careers. It's got to be important, but hopefully it becomes irrelevant. We should all aspire to that. But the biggest thing that you're going to find in your careers, and it's always been the biggest differentiator in my view, and I think always will be, is leadership. Leadership, no matter what your background is the hallmark differentiator. Nothing will ever matter more than leadership. Technical proficiency matters. Being smart matters and certainly helps. But what I've found time and time again is that while being smart helps, the smartest guy in the room doesn't necessarily rise to the top. And it's because the great leaders have charisma, they know how to get things done, they have passion, and they have the ability to inspire others to achieve more than they could without that leader otherwise being there. And I think as you kind of think about your careers, that is the single biggest thing that you should think about and try to cultivate in college, because this is basically a learning laboratory. Even if you screw up every single day at it, view it as a learning experience. Be the president of this or the vice president of that or the treasury of this or the secretary of that. I know you guys are all trying to load up your resumes on this stuff anyway. So, this is the kind of thing that you don't use it as a resume filler. Actively practice skills that are going to matter when you get into the workforce, because that is going to be the differentiator when you join the workforce. Okay? So those are just a couple thoughts, and with that, I'd love to take some questions. If there aren't questions, I'll ask you some questions and we can have kind of a discussion. So,
yeah, I have another question. You spoke of leadership for current employees and potential employees, such as college students. Do GE offer leadership conferences? And have you ever attended one? Can you tell me what goes on at the conference?
What do you mean, like a leadership conference?
For example, I went to one before for Mayotte. It's you go, they have a keynote speaker, and they have different little stations they go around. You learn about those leadership skills, then they groom you, or take the skills that you do have and try to grow them. Yeah,
we do. The short answer is yes. We don't do it a lot, to my knowledge. Jason, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't do it a lot on campus as much. And we do some things. We participate in some of the classes here. We talk about leadership here. Actually, our CEO was here a couple years ago. We do within the company, first of all, we have entry-level programs that are leadership-oriented, and we recruit for leadership skills to bring young leaders into these programs. Once in, we have a variety of different, leadership development classes. We have formal speaker series. We have a conference, several conferences throughout the year. In fact, we have one coming up in finance in July, I believe, where the focus is going to be principally on mergers and acquisitions and leadership lessons learned in that process. And so the short answer is yes, and we do that in every one of our functional disciplines. We do it all throughout the year, and then I think GE's real hallmark, our hallmark is actually leadership development training, but the other thing that we do is we have our own, call it in-house university, located in Crotonville, New York, where we take entry-level managers, kind of mid-level and junior managers, and all the way up to senior executives, and put them through very rigorous training classes for dedicated 2-3 weeks at a time. And so we do it really at all levels, whether it's conferences, whether it's on-hand or hands-on training, whether it's classroom sessions, all types of leadership, you would find that at GE. In fact, we spend about $1 billion annually on leadership development training at GE. So it's a big deal. And we kind of pride ourselves on being one of the foremost thinkers in leadership and certainly influencers, along with a couple other companies. So, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering if you can talk a bit about several experiences that you personally have had in your career with diversity or global skills, where you where they have to come out, or where you learn something along that line.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'll give you a very recent example. In 2007, we bought a company called Smiths Aerospace. Okay, Smiths Aerospace was part of a company known as the Smiths Group. They're based out of the UK, and they were a FTSE 100 company, and we bought the aerospace division. They manufacture avionics equipment, mechanical actuation. So this is the stuff that you find in the cockpit, on the wings, landing gear, things of that nature. And so GE, as you know, is a very largely US-based company in terms of its manufacturing footprint. Again, our employment has tilted global. And we're buying now a 10,000 person strong UK company, okay? And it was unique in several different respects. Smiths Aerospace had grown up through a series of different acquisitions over several years. And so what we found when we bought the business was you had multiple cultural differences that existed within the company, let alone us trying to buy this company and integrating it into GE. So let me give you a couple specifics. The first was that there was very much a UK versus US mentality. So half of the company was US based, half of the company was UK based. And it was exacerbated by the fact that the two largest airframe manufacturers are Airbus and Boeing, French and US. Okay, so you had a Euro, mostly UK versus US mentality, and you had a significant culture clash as a result of that. The second thing was that within each of the companies that they'd bought, they'd never really been integrated. And each of those companies had its own unique corporate culture, okay? The third thing was that there was a pretty significant age disparity. So I became the CFO of that business. I think I was 34 at the time. And I was the youngest person by about 12 years, okay? So, and after that, like the average was probably between 48 to 52. And so it tilted towards a much more senior workforce, and so there was sort of a cultural gap when it came to age. And then the other thing was that there were very few women in the company that we bought. I mean, in the senior ranks, there was one. And then in the company at large, it was a fairly small minority, very underrepresented in engineering, for example, very underrepresented in finance, which is my function, and there was basically no kind of racial diversity whatsoever. So it was a unique thing in many levels, and our challenge was first and foremost to integrate the company within GE, which has its own very unique corporate culture. And what we found right off the bat is that it just wasn't that simple. It was a matter of having to merge them with GE and try to take the best of both, but at the same time we had to integrate this company. We had to try to find a way to ensure that women had opportunities within that company. We had to figure out this US-UK kind of divisiveness that appeared to exist, and we had to inject more youth at the company. And we had to do that basically all at the same time within a span of 6 to 12 months. And professionally, it was probably the formative experience in my career, because while we were doing all of that, we went through very heavy restructuring, where 1,000 to 2,000 people were put out of work for a variety of different reasons. And so that was a pretty significant challenge. And to be honest, we're not done with it yet. I think we've more or less solved the GE Smiths thing in terms of meshing those two cultures. I mean, to a degree, that's a bit of a takeover, right? We're clearly the buyer in that case in a much larger company. The gender thing, we're not even close. The US versus UK thing, I think we've largely, I wouldn't say solved. I mean, you never want to say you've solved this stuff, but we've gotten after it in the sense that one of the first things we did was immediately cross-pollinate talent. So we took UK managers and put them in the US. We took US managers and put them in the UK. That helped immensely, actually, in terms of just better understanding those unique viewpoints. And in terms of integrating the companies that existed previously, that's an ongoing thing. I mean, aerospace manufacturers, I don't know if you knew this or not, but they're very ingrained in the way that they do things, and that's a very hard thing to break. And it's not necessarily a good thing to break it, because that's what kind of made them great along the way. And so we've tried very delicately to preserve the best aspects of that, especially as it relates to being innovative and having technology advances. But at the same time, you know, for lack of a better word, brainwashing them with sort of the GE way of doing things. And so for me, that was very difficult. It's an ongoing thing. I'm not in that business anymore, but I think they've come out of it largely better. I will tell you that they fought some of this stuff at the same time. You know, I think, again, because diversity tends to be a kind of a US concept, as I talked about in the beginning, you know, the UK team, not because they're bad people or anything like that, they just didn't really understand what the big deal was around gender diversity, for example. They just didn't understand what the big deal was with racial diversity. These just aren't concepts that were as vivid in the UK or certainly the broader Europe, even though those are countries that are much more multicultural in many ways, right? Because there's a lot more kind of cross-border travel. And so those were all things that we struggled with mightily, and frankly that we're still struggling with. But I think we've made a lot of progress there. So that's kind of one very salient recent example that was very interesting, you know, to kind of work through. Does that help? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
Well, you had talked about the challenges of business space. Personally, have you had any personal challenges that you faced working globally, just communicating with others, just any experiences that you've had?
Great question. Personally, from the standpoint of what? Maybe, let me ask that.
From the standpoint of personal challenges you faced as far as interacting, working with others in a global environment.
Yeah, I think the short answer is no, but the long answer is this, and this is important. Language helps. Okay, there are so many nuances. Maybe a quick show of hands, who's done an assignment overseas or traveled overseas during school? So okay, so it's okay, a couple people. How many people speak more than English? Okay, so that's pretty good. That is critical, okay? I mean, knowing a little Spanish these days is probably a pretty good thing. Knowing a little Portuguese probably wouldn't hurt you. Knowing a little Mandarin, probably gonna help a little bit. Knowing a little Russian will help a lot. Knowing some Arabic, probably not gonna kill you. I mean, the reality is that this is where US companies are doing business. I mean, I look at GE, I'm gonna answer your question, okay, in an indirect way. If I look at GE, I mean, we have very strong leadership positions from a market share standpoint in the US. And so the growth for us has to come from outside the US. And it's not in Western Europe, where we have pretty strong positions as well, and the economies, frankly, are not growing really at all right now, right? They're kind of growing at 0 to 1% GDP. Southeast Asia is great, and Japan is basically not growing at all, another very large economy. And then China and India are growing a lot. I didn't say Hindi, by the way, because most Indians speak English. But knowing language matters, though, because there are so many nuances that you lose if you don't speak the language, right? I mean, those of you that speak another language know this. I mean, there are things you cannot say in English that are the same when translated, right? Or they don't translate at all in some cases. And so being able to travel to Mexico, do business in Mexico, speak Spanish during the course of the transaction, being able to interpret a contract, being able to participate in a side conversation, being able to go out with the client and have a beer and converse and joke in Spanish, that matters more than you could possibly imagine. Doing it with a translator, not very effective. And that's the struggle that I face. Okay, so when I go to Japan, where English is not as widely spoken, you know, I have to get a Japanese translator. And you know, what happens in these instances is that the translator tries to sort of they're smarter by half in a way, in that they try to start inferring what you mean, and it's not really what you mean, but you don't know because they've just translated it into Japanese and you don't speak any Japanese, so who the hell knows what just happened, right? And the reality too is that business sometimes gets done in conference rooms, but most business gets done in hallway conversations, on the golf course, in bars, and those are casual moments, right? And when people are hanging out and speaking casually, they don't want to do it in a forced tongue, they want to do it in their mother tongue. And so I think if you can speak another language, and if you don't right now, it's not like all is lost. I mean, Rosetta Stone is in every single airport in the country, and it's not that hard, okay? I mean, I've done it myself, and I think it's a very, very valuable skill. And I can tell you as a company, a multinational company, increasingly we're recruiting for it. So if people don't speak another language, you're going to miss out. So I think that that's a very big deal. With respect to other stuff, I think the reality is English still is the language of business. It's just the nuance gets lost if you don't speak the language. But I think today, we're in a bizarre industry. Our industry, nearly every transaction is denominated in dollars, even if it occurs in China or Japan or France, and all of the contracts are written in English. So we're in a kind of a unique, almost backwards industry in that respect. So it hasn't necessarily limited me. In other travel experiences and other GE divisions I've had, though, I think it's been a bit of a barrier in that I just don't fully appreciate how the culture informs the way that people think about business problems. So I think, again, language is one aspect of it, and then when you travel to another country, don't go to, immerse yourself in it, I think is sort of the lesson there. Don't go to the Irish pub. Go to, if you're in Shanghai, go to the one in which no one speaks, bless you, where anybody speaks any English. You'll get a much better sense of what things are all about. Don't hang out downtown where all of the buildings look like you're standing in the middle of New York City. Go to a rural area where there are still, 10 million people. So those experiences I think are going to be a lot more relevant for you, and there's a lot more to be gained from that stuff. And I think I've not done that as well as I should have in many instances. So kind of a roundabout way of answering your question. Yep.
You mentioned how some of your boardrooms you've been around, around the world, are more diverse, increasingly as the years have gone by. Do you think that GE personally will ever reach a goal or reach a point in their tenure where they'll be complacent with the diversity initiatives?
I don't think so. I think. In fact, I don't think so at all. I mean, I think it's become more and more and more prominent as time has gone on. I think it's sort of what I said in the beginning. What we should aspire to is that it becomes sort of purposely irrelevant because every room looks like this. If that happens, that's like the best outcome possible. And then it's okay to be complacent because you would think we'd solved it. Now, it's probably one of these kinds of problems that you never quite solve, and so I think you've always got to be ahead of it. I think we're doing more now than we ever have in our history, and we keep ramping up the effort year after year after year. I've seen our commitment to it grow. I think that the organizations that I spoke of earlier, these forums, they started out as a couple hundred people. They now number into the thousands. I think the global footprint of the company, given that we tilt more international, I think that's forced us to think about a whole new set of problems to solve and cultures to reconcile. And, it's so much fun. I don't think we're going to stop focusing on it. So I think it's going to become more important, not less. The tenor of the conversation may change, but I think it's going to become more important. Yep.
Kind of answer that some, but what are some visible benefits that you've seen since your company, since the actual place you're working at has become more diverse and on a more global aspect since GE has become more diverse?
Well, like a tangible benefit?
Yeah, there's some tangible.
Okay. So here's another real specific example. So we manufacture aircraft engines, right, among many other things. When we manufacture an aircraft engine, it's kind of like an automobile in some ways. We make more money than the auto companies do. But the content of an aircraft engine is as follows. we have different kinds of engines, but so I'll give you two examples actually. One kind of engine we make, it's called a CFM engine. CFM is a joint venture between GE and Safran, which is a French company. The content of that engine is 50% GE, 50% French, SNECMA, okay? We make other kinds of engines in which the content is a bit more diversified, where we make usually around 60% of it, and the balance of the content is French, Japanese, German, Swedish, increasingly Chinese, and I'm missing one. I want to say Portuguese. So you have 6, 7 different countries that are participating in the content of the engine. By simply diversifying the manufacturing product itself, how do you think it works when we try to sell an engine into Japan versus another guy who has 100% sourced, US sourced engine? It helps, right? I mean, being able to walk into a Japanese customer and say, to Japan Airlines, maybe that's a bad example since they just declared bankruptcy, All Nippon Airways, going into that customer and saying, we have Japanese content in the engine, that matters, right? It's important. I mean, it helps that economy prosper. Going into Lufthansa, which is one of the largest airlines in the world, if not the largest airline in the world, and being able to say, we have German content in the engine, that matters, right? And so we're doing it in some ways out of necessity. I mean, those guys, for the stuff that they make and the parts of the engine that they're in, they make the best product. So we don't care if they're German, we don't care if they're Japanese or Chinese or whatever. We just care that they make the best product and that it best complements our core. And being able to do that and then being able to go and sell it better because it's a more international product, not because of some diversity strategy, but because we're just trying to take the best of everybody, that has tangible benefits. And we've sold more aircraft engines as a consequence of that. I know that, okay? I think the other thing is that when we're in sales campaigns and we're selling engines, we're often on the phone with our salespeople in different parts of the world. And what's interesting is that you get a much better answer. We use people's knowledge and skills of problems from what they've worked in the past and brought that to bear. And that tends to be US centric. We bring in someone who's worked a similar campaign of a similar nature. Maybe the deal structure was a little bit similar in the UK. We've done the same thing in Japan, and the customer is ultimately Chinese. I'm kind of making up this example. We actually had a recent one that's pretty close to that. And hearing the viewpoints that each of those campaigns had that they fought for and on, and the lessons that they learned both culturally as well as the customer's wants and needs, that helped a lot in terms of going and winning business in China. And I think we're finding that with a lot of our sales campaigns, and having a more diverse team, not because it's a noble thing to do, it may be, but because it's a business necessity, has created a better answer to the problem. And I have no doubt about that. Okay? Other questions? Yep.
I'm very interested in the issue you said that came about when the other company was purchased, the issue about US versus UK cultural clash. Would you expand on how you went about to actually smooth that? I know you talked about the relocating some people from the UK and putting them in the US, some US employees and putting them in the UK, but were there other strategies that you actually implemented to make sure this was a little more
Well, I think part of it was just exposing them to, Smith's group tended to be a very UK-centric company and tended to do a lot of their business in the UK itself. And I think what we found immediately was that just giving people access to a company in which we have more global resources and people that, we source knowledge actually in different parts of the world. So we have literally thousands of engineers in India and China, thousands of engineers in Germany, thousands of engineers in Mexico. Partly there's some cost benefits to that, but there's also a lot of intellectual capital in those areas. And I think once they saw that having a global intellectual footprint like that has real benefits, and giving them access to kind of the toolkit that we have that they didn't have previously, I think that actually cleared a lot of hurdles right off the bat. I think the cross-pollination helped because it gave people a perspective on the other side of the pond that they just didn't have, having worked in their home country for a long period of time. I think the other thing that we found was that Smith's had and still does had a very strong defense business, and the Department of Defense that they dealt with was the Ministry of Defense in the UK, which has kind of a different set of running rules than does the Department of Defense in the US. And I think to the degree that we could, because you have to be careful when it comes to the government, but to the degree that we could cross-pollinate a little bit there and develop some different perspectives in terms of the way that the government procures, that helped a lot as well. Just giving them exposure to that and seeing how negotiations occur outside of a Ministry of Defense context, more so in a DoD context. I think that helped a lot too. So those were kind of three things that we did that helped a lot. And then the fourth that we did was we tried very, very quickly. We have a very rigorous kind of HR process, and we took all of their top talent and managers, we identified them very, very quickly and very early on, and immediately sent them to our Management Institute in Crotonville, New York. And so, again, I'm saying this somewhat lightheartedly, there's an element of brainwashing that helps a little bit as well. But again, when you see the access and the resources that a very, very large company has, and the things that we can bring to bear, and some of the management disciplines that we've developed over time, that's pretty powerful for them, because they didn't have access to any of that type of stuff. And all of the UK, US type stuff just melted away. It was all about how do we leverage this vast set of resources in this company and this intellectual power all around the globe to win more business.
That seems to be from the UK side. Was the US side willing to work, or did they have anything, any other maybe hurdles to jump?
A big one, and I'd go back to this defense thing, is our view of the world was that the only Defense Department worth spending time on was the US Department of Defense. Now, they do happen to be by far and away the largest spender in the world, but the Ministry of Defense actually represents a very significant opportunity in terms of business for us. And that was something that the US guys had just never even realized. I mean, it's sort of an obvious thing, right? Like, the UK is a pretty prominent country worldwide. They have a very prominent military. Wow, they have a Ministry of Defense. So that was almost a sort of revelation for us and a new business opportunity that opened up quickly. And I think when they saw the value of that, it became pretty cool. I think the other thing that happened is that they saw that in some of the UK companies, there were some pretty powerful technology capabilities and some really neat products that we didn't have. And again, it became less about do a bunch of people in the UK versus US make it. It became about, hey, you know what? You guys make some great products and have some great technologies. We make some great products and have some great technologies. You over there, you have some great products and great technologies. We have this massive global supply chain over here. We have a bunch of intellectual capital over here. How do we pool all of that together to win as much business as we can with Boeing and Airbus? And you know, Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman in defense. And that's what it became about. And so again, I think it broke down a lot of different things at once very quickly, and that was a powerful experience. I think there's a question here, and I'll do you.
Actually, it's two questions. Firstly, like how would you like assess talent or leadership skills, especially within like new people? And secondly, so when did you see this as being an issue? Like, was it pre-acquisition, during the acquisition?
Which one?
The whole cultural.
Okay, so two totally different questions. So let me answer the second one first, and then I'll get to the first one. In terms of the second one, we saw it right off the bat. I mean, walking into the room, you could tell. There was one woman, there was a lot of gray hair, there was no diversity. I mean, it was pretty obvious in some respects. It was very UK dominated. The other kind of element that I didn't talk about was a lot of that team was from Rolls-Royce, and that's Rolls-Royce and GE sort of mixed like oil and water in some respects. So we knew and could tell right off the bat, and once we read a few resumes, it was patently obvious. So it wasn't hard for us to figure out. It was just, once you have the problem, now what do you do about it? And that's where we spent all the time. So it was pretty easy.
Before the acquisition, you came up with the actual.
That was before, yeah. It was obvious during the due diligence, okay? With respect to leadership, how do we identify it? That was the question.
How do you assess it?
Yeah, how do we assess it? I think here's the way I assess it. I'm not going to say that this is how everybody at GE does, but I think this tends to be true, but this is how I do. The first thing is that I think the single biggest hallmark trait of a leader is someone who's able to take charge of a room without actually having any power. Okay, so it's easy for me to get up here and you guys have to listen to me because I've got the mic and I'm a little bit older, maybe I have a little bit more experience, so you guys are vaguely interested in what I have to say. Okay, that's easy. All right, real influence in leadership is when you don't have the title, you don't have the power, and you're still able to get everybody else to get something done because it's either the right thing to do or because you have tremendous charisma or you're inspiring, excuse me. And that's easy to see. It's sometimes hard to coach, okay? But that's something that we see pretty quickly in people. In the campus interviewing process, we are not fooled by resumes that tend to say vice president next to every single club and activity. And we know some of that stuff's made up. So we ask detailed questions. What did you do? You know, what did you learn? We've done this for a while, so we're pretty good at sussing out exactly whether that was a real answer or the answer that was just rehearsed for the interview. So we try to detect it very quickly there. We look at the resumes, and I graduated from here. I tend to know which of the positions matter, where people tend to have influence, where they've been able to make a difference. Sometimes, people have something really unique that we just haven't seen before, and that tends to stand out pretty fast. So we look for it there. We do coach people on it. We provide a lot of training in terms of what are the latest management techniques. We provide almost like an unhealthy amount of feedback. I mean, we do it so frequently, and I tend to do it pretty in your face. I mentor a lot of people. I mean, that's just time, right? It's not quality, it's quantity. I spend easily 1/3 of my time on people development and recruiting and mentoring, young people. I tend to mentor a lot of Indian Americans. That's just by coincidence. I tend to mentor actually a lot of other people as well. But I also spend a lot of time with some of the people on my staff that I see being able to replace me in the next 2, 3, 5 years, let's say. And there's nothing you can do on that other than just spend an excruciating amount of time. And if you don't enjoy it, and if you don't enjoy seeing people succeed, and you don't see that same desire in others, they're probably not going to be good leaders either. That's Khozema Shipchandler's view, okay? So, but I think we're pretty good at it, and that's how we've done it over time, and I think we get 9.5 out of 10 right. So, you had a question?
Yeah. Sorry. So I'm just becoming a finance intern, and you are a CFO, so there's a difference between us. As someone looking down and discussing diversity, I know there's 2,000 other interns in my class.
Yep.
I know I need to differentiate myself. And also, as president, I always wish I could just tell some of my members, like, do this, and it would really stick out. Like, is there any advice that you have? Especially, I would like to focus on my passion, one being diversity, in terms of someone who's looking to go up in diversity. Does that make sense?
Again, I'll give you, this is not the official GE thing, I'll tell you what I do, okay? I mean, I tend to be more blunt on these things. If people aren't into it, you know what I tell them is don't come. Don't show up. I do not want you here if you're not into it. I don't know what the point would be. If it's a resume filler, you're not going to be able to defend it in an interview anyway. So if you're not into whatever the cause, I mean, it could be a philanthropic cause, it could be the diversity thing that you're talking about, it could be the internship program. Don't be here to check the box. If you're not into it, you've got other things that you want to do anyway. Go do those. So I think you should tell people, first of all. Again, my opinion, not an official view, but I think that's a starting point. The second thing is give people a reason to care. I mean, different people tend to be motivated by different things. You know, I have some people on my team where they will run through walls for me, and all they want is a pat on the back. Literally a pat on the back, not public, just for me to walk over to their office and say, Chris, you did a great job today. And that they'll go home that night and want to come back in the morning and take a beating all over again because that was motivating to them. Other people, it's money. You know, you got to be generous sometimes. Now, you don't have that luxury in your specific example, but I'm just saying, broadly speaking, you know, sometimes you've got to write people checks. You know, if somebody does a particularly great job, then, you know, we'll peel off $2,500 and make sure that they get it in their pocket within a few days. You know, sometimes it's more generous than that. It'll be stock options or something of that nature. You know, other times it's public. If someone just went way above and beyond, I mean, you know, people like to be publicly recognized sometimes, right? If you congratulate them in front of their peers, I think that can be pretty motivating for some people. Again, some people are shy and they're not into that, but others are into it, and you know, the ones that are shy tend to like kind of the pats on the back sometimes. Others just want to feel like they're contributing to something without any of the other charade. They just want to feel like that what they're doing is meaningful and that what they're doing at a very low level somehow is contributing to the overall mission of the organization. I mean, this is something we face all the time where you have a junior analyst, how do they figure into the $3.5 billion that aviation is going to make this year? You know, well, we've got to explain that to them sometimes, right? You do this, it allows a senior person to make this decision. We won that business as a result, and that was at a 30% margin rate, and we generated $100 million because of it. That's not hard to do. It takes time, but it's not hard to do. So I think any of those techniques works, but there's no cookie cutter thing. I mean, you've got, again, it takes time. You've got to invest your time in understanding what motivates every single individual along the line. The ones that care. If they don't want to be there or they're just checking boxes, tell them to get out. But the ones that care, you've got to figure out what motivates them, and I think there are all sorts of different things that probably, if I were to pick this whole front row and say what motivates you guys, everyone would be different. And that's okay, but that puts a bigger onus on the manager. So that's kind of the answer. Yep.
When you look at a possible acquisition and you see a lack of diversity, do you think of that as a specific cost that you're going to take into consideration when you look at the acquisition, or is that just an obstacle that GE has developed a strategy that they just plow through and it's not even taken into consideration?
I don't think I mean, the short answer is no. We don't evaluate lack of diversity as a specific cost of doing an acquisition. I mean, again, I think but when we buy businesses, we're trying to enhance our existing portfolio. We're trying to buy something strategic. We're trying to get our hands on some technology. Whatever the company is at that specific moment in time, the one thing we know for a fact is going to be that that's not what they're going to be a year after we buy them. And so we're pretty good at assimilating companies that we buy into our culture, into our way of doing business, which extends to things like integrity, by the way, too, which I haven't talked at all about, but we're good at that. So as long as it's a rich acquisition in terms of the capabilities that they bring, then all the rest of it we're pretty good at figuring out. So I don't really think we evaluate it as an explicit cost.